Hi, I'm Heather Darch, and this is a presentation by the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. In this series, we are telling the stories of our vanishing heritage. It's about men and women who made homes and opportunities from the dense forest of the eastern townships, who felled trees, burned potash, processed lime, and made successful farms and businesses. It's about the communities they founded that no longer exist, except for small markers, gravestones, foundations, relics, and ruins. We are looking for these vestiges of village and family life. This is Magoon's Point.
My personal interest relative to the village of Magoon's Point is twofold. As a historian, I'm always naturally curious about various communities and the history of various locales in this particular area. Personally, on the other side, my family, the Brevorts, were originally from Missisquoi, and they transplanted to this area and acquired a farm right on the actual point of Magoon's Point. And so my great-great-great-grandparents resided in this community and were quite active in the community. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was the postmaster, and he was a bit of a character as well. My name is Stephen Moore. I'm a local historian, and I'm past president of the Georgeville Historical Society, and I'm still a member of the board. Today we're located in Stanstead Township, specifically in the one-time village of Magoon's Point in Stanstead Township, which was part of Stanstead County. Now it's part of the MRC of Lake Memphremagog. As you can see by looking around, there's nothing left to visualize as you pass along the roadside. There's no indication whatsoever that during the 1800s that this village ever existed. To find any evidence that there was a community here at one time, one has to go off-road, so to speak, and find various historical remnants that are found in the countryside. The location where we are right at the moment is a large promontory that extends out into Lake Memphremagog, and it acquired the name of Magoon's Point because the Magoons were one of the families that settled in this area, and they were quite numerous and they had large families, and so the name was derived from that. The actual location of the village is really tied to the lime industry, which got going as early as the 1820s. It's sandwiched right between the limestone quarries on one side of the road and the kiln, the refinement process down on the lakeshore. The raison d'etre for this village was initially the lime industry. Outcrops of limestone were found above the road, and there was the process of extraction, and then the raw product was carted down to the lakeshore where there was a large stone kiln erected, and lime was produced in the kilns for sale throughout the townships. The original settlers to this area, like the rest of this whole region, were all usually Americans. They were seeking free land. The populations in New England at the time were becoming overextended, and there was a lot of land that was taken out of service by land speculators. So the only option for many New Englanders was to come north, where as of the Constitutional Act of 1791, the townships, or what we know as the Eastern Townships, was opened up for settlement. And for the sake of changing their allegiance to the British Crown, they were enabled to acquire usually in the vicinity of 200 acres each. So it was a great incentive. At the time, travel was made easy in terms of the natural inclinations of the mountains and the valleys and the river systems, which all ran in a north-south inclination. So for the first quarter century of the 19th century, travel through this area was relatively easy and wasn't really abated until the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, and that sort of diverted in another direction. So the people around here that settled Magoon's Point and all around Lake Memphremagog came from New England, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, all those areas, and they came up here to find free land and were able to prosper as a result. The actual village of Magoon's Point was never very large. It was always a small hamlet. It didn't have many of the larger infrastructure that one would associate with larger communities like the villages of Georgeville and Fitch Bay. It didn't have any artisans to speak of. There were no religious institutions, for example. But it did have a post office. That was a major sign of acceptance in the greater world, because that enabled your community to be listed in the various directories that were published during the 1800s. It did have a cemetery, it did have a boarding house, it had various private residents, and of course nearby farms. The production of lime was only half the story relating to the history and the reason for the village of Magoon's Point. The other half of the story was the agricultural industry surrounding the village and on Magoon's Point itself. Back in the 1800s, when Stanstead Township retained its original territorial limits, which today would include municipalities of Ogden and Stanstead East, the farmland on Magoon's Point was one of the most productive in the whole township. My great-great-grandfather's farm on the point, for example, was 270 acres, a good-sized farm. The production was mainly based on the dairy industry. The dairy herds on the point were considerably larger than the average for the whole township. Most farms, on average, kept approximately 4-point-something milking cows per farm, whereas my great-grandfather's farm, for example, had a herd of 25 milking cows, and there were 4 farmers on the point that had herds in the double digits. So it was a very productive area. The main product was the production of butter. The average was around 400 per farm township-wide. There were other larger producers that ranged from 700 to around 1,500 pounds of butter per year. Based on the 1871 census, we know that production here was much higher. My great-grandfather, for example, produced almost 4,000 pounds of butter. And the butter was found a ready market either in Montreal or to the south, primarily in the Boston area. And it was a major factor in the productivity of the farms in this area. All the farms, just by the nature of the land, had full sun exposure to the south, and so they reaped the benefits of their geographic position. Right now I'm standing on top of the lime kiln, which is where the limestone, which was extracted from the quarries above the road, was transported down here by wagon and horse and wagon, and it was deposited here on top of the lime kiln itself, and then the carts would continue on in a circular manner and circulate back up to the quarries for additional loads of limestone. The limestone was cooked in an oven-like kiln, very analogous to the production of maple syrup. The calcium in the limestone was cooked and evaporated until the residue became the actual lime that was produced here in the kilns. It was then loaded into barrels, loaded onto barges, and then transported by steamships all over the lake, as far away as Newport and up the main body of the lake, as well as up the arm of Fitch Bay, which is just around the point, up to the Ryder store in the village of Fitch Bay, where it was sold locally. The Production of lime was an important commodity. It was used to spread on local agricultural fields to reduce the acidity of the soil. Lime was also used in the manufacture of mortar for building brick structures and stone fireplaces, what have you, as well as for the chinking of log cabins. There were also not only medicinal uses, but also as a disinfectant. Lime was spread on the carcasses of dead animals, for example. It was also, when diluted with water, was used as a whitewash in barns and stables, as a disinfectant and as a preventative for infection. So it was quite a valuable commodity. At the time, in 1871, the production of lime on Magoon's Point was the largest industrial operation outside of the communities of Rock Island and Stanstead. So it was a larger operation vis-a-vis all the sawmills in the township, and so it was a significant operation here on Magoon's Point. Right now I'm standing on the site of the Magoon Point one-room schoolhouse. As you can see, all that's left is the stone foundation. Its location is rather odd. We don't know why it was located in this particular area, because it is some distance from the village proper, probably maybe half a mile. We can only speculate that perhaps the local landowner donated this particular plot of land for the purposes of having a school for the village. It was a typical country schoolhouse with a stove in the middle and students all huddled around trying to keep warm in the wintertime. At one point, my great-great-grandmother was the teacher, and also one of my great aunts was a teacher later on, and she was quite famous for letting the kids go up on the hillside up here and go sliding during the winter instead of tending to their schoolwork. We don't know much about the actual schoolhouse itself. We know it existed in 1881 because it appeared on the Belden Atlas. And when it was initially constructed, we're not sure. But it was the second generation of schoolhouse for this area. There was an earlier one, apparently. We have references to it, but we don't know where it was or how big it was. There was also apparently in the rock formation off to my side here, a large woodshed and outhouses, one on either side for girls and boys. And there's one notable story where apparently one of the local farmers' ram got loose and corralled the kids in the outhouse, and they couldn't get back to the school until somebody came and captured the ram. But that's just one of the local stories. But this particular school closed up in the 1920s when all the small one-room schoolhouses in the township were closed and amalgamated into larger schools in the nearby communities, larger communities of Georgeville and Fitch Bay. I don't know the circumstances of this one, but most of them were sold off to individuals who tore them down or used the wood or used them for other purposes. This is all that remains. When I was growing up, my grandmother was always telling me various tales about Magoon's Point, and she would often mention Still Brook. And I always thought it was reference to a local brook that just ran slow and still, and that's why it was named Still Brook. But as you can hear, it was not still at all. The real basis of the name was the fact that there was a moonshine still way up in the woods, and the brook itself was used to make moonshine by a member of the Magoon family. And there's quite a tale to it. Apparently, of course, this was all against government regulation, and the federal agents would often come looking for him, and they could never find Mr. Magoon or his still operation. I guess he would move it around from time to time and hide it, and they never did find him. But he was quite famous for producing moonshine for the local population. I'm standing in the middle of the abandoned cemetery of Magoon's Point. It's situated off the road a short distance and currently is not visible from the road, so anybody passing by wouldn't even know that it existed here. The predominant name that you will see is Magoon, so the assumption is that it started off as a family cemetery for the Magoon family, and probably as the community grew, various other members from the area were also buried here. A inventory of stones was taken in the 1960s, and the earliest stone recorded at that point in time was the early 1820s. So we know the cemetery dates back at least to that time period. It is believed that it is a second generation cemetery, that an earlier cemetery existed somewhere between here and Georgeville, nearby in this vicinity, but efforts to find it have proven fruitless. And so this is all that remains. The production of lime on Magoon's Point added an advantage because the percentage of calcium that was present in the limestone in this particular area was advantageous because it was higher vis-a-vis the other areas. Ironically, that percentage of calcium was, in the end, its death knell, because in the area northeast of Sherbrooke, in the area known as Bishopton and Lime Ridge, the percentage of calcium was even higher. So although the production of lime in that particular area dated back to the early 1800s like it did here, eventually, because of its higher calcium content, it warranted production on a massive scale. And so it just, in effect, put the production of lime in this particular area and all around Lake Memphremagog out of production. It just wasn't profitable anymore because they had a greater advantage. And so by the turn of the century, by the end of the 1800s, the production of lime here on Magoon's Point just faded away. It was the beginning of the end for the village of Magoon's Point. A little bit later, in the early 1900s, the production of butter continued on, but that, together with the effects of the Great Depression, was the final death knell, not only for Magoon's Point, but for also a lot of area villages. What really brought the end agriculturally was the closing of the border in 1930 to the import of butter into the United States. The Americans wanted to protect their own farmers and dairy operations, and so they closed the border, and that was the end. And so from there on, even the local farms started to die off. So in the end, Magoon's Point became a lost village. As you drive down the road, there's no sign whatsoever that there was any habitation here whatsoever. All you see is open agricultural fields. So the memory, the history of the people that once lived here is more or less gone forever, except for people like myself who are interested in history and local historical society who try to document what occurred here. It's important to remember the people that lived here, they had lives, they had families, they pursued social interactivity, and it's important to remember that there was an existence here for those families.